Thank you for that warm applause. No, it's wonderful to have Dr. Butler with us, and as you all know, our presidential scholar in residence, Dr. Fish. I joked with him last year during the Socratic stage. We called him Michael Jordan because he was always dueling with Richard Epstein from University of Chicago, but he was the amazing entertainment at many of our great Socratic stages last year. But this is a great event. As you know, the Socratic stage, we only started, it's in its infancy. We're really kind of transitioning into year 2. If you haven't looked at the website, it's an amazing lineup of people that we have coming. And it just already booking for the fall and next spring. So it's just been fantastic. Dr. Butler is someone that we have been chasing probably for a year and trying to coordinate schedules and times. We were super ecstatic when she was able to make it for this spring. Our Socratic stage really came about just trying to say, how can you have, quote Justice Brandeis, the way to fight against or war against or challenge truths, perceived truths, falsehoods, all of those things is not with silence, it's with more speech. And so the concept was we could have a forum, we could have great free speech and have more and more of it and just bring in the great debates of the time and show the world that we can do it civilly, we can do it wonderfully, and everybody can take something away from it and learn. And that's what we're doing. The entire Socratic stage has been underwritten with just tremendous generosity, but no one more than Michael and Ling Markovitz, who are sitting right here. So I'd ask you guys to stand, please. And with that, we will get to the celebrities. The first is Dr. Judith Butler. She's the distinguished professor in the graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley. And I want everyone to have a great time, but if we can just keep it where the conversation here. In fact, we're going to have Q&A afterwards, so if you have a question afterwards, we like to say during that Q&A period, if it's a 30-second question, it's probably an amazingly good question. If it's a minute question, it's probably so-so, and after a minute, it's not a good question. So if somebody wants to be a part of the Socratic stage, we will invite you and get with Alexandra, but we really came to listen to Dr. Butler and Dr. Fish. But if we could just have a full civil discourse throughout the whole process, it would be a wonderful evening for everybody. Thank you. Dr. Butler is the author of several books, including Who's Afraid of Gender and Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. Dr. Butler has been active in several human rights organizations, including the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York and the Academic Council of Jewish Voice for Peace. Dr. Butler received the Adorno Prize from the city of Frankfurt for outstanding contributions to feminist and moral philosophy, the Brudner Prize from Yale University for lifetime achievement in gay and lesbian studies, the Catalan International Prize in 2022, and the American Council of Learned Society for lifetime achievement. Dr. Butler is a member of the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and is a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. Dr. Butler has received grants from the Mellon Foundation for collaborative work in critical theory and holds 15 honorary degrees. Dr. Butler. Dr. Stanley Fish brings more than 60 years of scholarship with him to New College, where he serves, as I said, as a presidential scholar in residence. His incredible career has included stops at Duke, Johns Hopkins, Cal Berkeley. There is even a dedicated library archive of his work at the University of California, Irvine. Last week, we had a Socratic stage with a renowned professor, Dr. Deneen from Notre Dame. We had a reception before the Socratic stage, and in came Dr. Fish to partake in the reception, and Dr. Deneen almost fell to his knees in absolute admiration for Dr. Fish. But Dr. Fish is also has held the title of Davidson Kahn Distinguished University Professor and Professor of Law at Florida International University, Dean Emeritus of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Illinois at Chicago. The Chicago Tribune named Dr. Fish the Chicagoan of the Year for Culture in 2003. In the past 30 years, there have been some 200 articles, books, parts of books, dissertations, review articles devoted to his work. Dr. Fish earned his undergraduate degree from University of Pennsylvania and his master's and PhD from Yale. Professor Fish has published more than 20 books, and his latest is Law in the Movies, Oxford 2024. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Fish.
Thank you very much, President Cochran. Look, now I ask you. Oh, sorry. How about this? Thank you. Now I ask you, does this person look like someone who is undermining Western civilization? It's Judith Butler, a Yale PhD, as you have heard, who taught at a number of major institutions and for some time now has been in the Department of Rhetoric and Complete at UC Berkeley. And, as your president has already said, an international superstar. Higher education is an enterprise of disciplines. And what that means is that most of us who write are writing to fellow workers in fairly narrow, demarcated fields. And we are responded to by those same fellow workers. Small groups like the Milton Society of America, to which I belong, and after 400 years, we're still trying to figure out what Milton meant by the phrase two-handed engine in Lycidas. That's what we do. Aside from the other 499, no one is interested. And that's the way it is in many academic contexts. You write for your close colleagues. But sometimes an academic will write something that, for any number of reasons, speaks to many disciplines. And I'm thinking, for example, of Noam Chomsky, whose vocabulary of deep and surface structure, or Edward Said, whose discourses on colonialism and post-colonialism, or Clifford Geertz, who introduced the idea of thick description. These people wrote in a discipline, but their work reached many disciplines. And then there are a few, even in this rarefied group, who break out of the academy entirely and become public figures, public intellectuals. And sometimes they become so well known that they can be hanged in effigy, which is something that has happened to our guest today. Why? Why would anyone do that to this obviously nice person? Well, one answer is an idea that she developed and introduced in one of her early books, and one that many of you will be familiar with, gendered performativity. That is, the idea that gender is not a fixed feature rooted in biology and therefore in objective fact, whatever that is, but is the production of, or the performance of, coded actions and verbal formulations that bring into being the very thing they point to and signify. So there's no bottom line, no absolute essential personhood, but rather personhood always on the wing and undergoing, at least potentially, repeated improvisation. That's scary enough to many people. But when you add to that, or when you extend that thesis, as Judith Butler has, to biology itself and to other entities that seem to most people to be just there, like the family, the facts of nature, or the fixity of norms, when you do that, many people become very nervous and react sometimes with a force usually reserved for invading armies. But that's enough of my no doubt inadequate summarizing, because here is the real thing. Judith Butler.
Well, thank you very much. I very much appreciate the invitation. I'm glad to be here and to be, again, in conversation with Stanley Fish. We disagree all the time, but I always find it interesting. And I've learned an enormous amount from him. I agree about the idea that a Socratic dialogue should be careful, and that it involves listening to what people say, listening carefully to language, and responding to what is said, not to what is imagined or what is projected, but really paying attention to the language itself. I did decide about 5 years ago to legally change my civil status, talk about civility, my civil status, to non-binary, and I do go by they. But here's the thing. I ask people to call me that, and whether or not they choose to honor my wishes is up to them, right? Because there's no police force that comes around and says, you got to do this. No, I'm not in favor of the police, actually. Although I'm glad for the security, and I did make sure it was here. But it's a request. It's a petition. This is who I am. This is the language that's right for me. You can, if that is of concern to you, you can call me by what I ask you to call me. But if that's not of concern to you, or you have some other concerns that you believe override my wish, you don't have to do it. Then we're in a little bit of a standoff, because I'll feel disrespected, but I'll probably still hang with you because you're still finding your way. Okay, so I wrote a book, and it has a question as its title: Who is afraid of gender? And I guess I should say, in some sense, all of us. If we think of gender as a set of norms that communicate expectations about how we should appear, how we should emerge in the world, what bodily form we should take, how we are to comport ourselves, then there is good reason to worry that one will fail at the task required, or that one will turn out to be not enough of a woman, or not enough of a man, or too much, or outside the category, or even possibly monstrous. Who sets those rules, and what freedom is there to change them over time? So gender, conceived as a normative organization of social reality, a set of implicit and sometimes explicit rules that organize society, is communicated, usually, especially when we're young, as a set of demands or expectations, maybe fantasies. And we understand that if we don't comply exactly, there can be painful consequences. So some might fear gender as one would fear any set of norms and possible mistakes, failures, or punishments. But there's something intimate about gender. It's the way that bodies are organized, but also a way they conduct themselves in relation to one another. It's this body, after all, material and singular, that is at once socially formed and acting with, against, or beyond the norms that formed me. Other people, mindful of this intimate dimension of gender, wish for a set structure, one that does not change in time, an identity fixed either by natural or symbolic law, or by the state itself. They fear the variability of gender, not only the different ways that men and women now act, but the apparent fact that the categories change meaning in time, that those assigned female at birth can, yes, become men, that those assigned male at birth can, yes, become women, that intersexed people born with mixed characteristics are demanding recognition for their embodied lives, that some people live outside the binary categories of man and woman, either in new categories or in the interstices among them. Have I destroyed Western civilization yet? Okay. So those who are unsettled by what I'm calling the variability of gender, its historical changes, its new vocabularies, are especially vulnerable to those politicians who insist that gender is something called an ideology, and, together with other forms of wokeism, are responsible for the destruction of the family, civilization, man, or national cultures. The anti-gender political discourse heightens the ordinary anxiety that people have about gender, associating and conflating that first anxiety with the generalized fear about the future of the world itself or one's way of life, the climate, the increasing precarity of work, the intensification of wealth among the very few, the open-ended character of brutal wars, the challenges to the homogeneity of national and local cultures posed by migration and displacement. I mean, there are many reasons that people have fear these days. They live with anxiety of all kinds. But I want to submit to you that gender is not the cause of any of those conditions that have given rise to a generalized concern about the future of the world. It is said that gender is doctrine, like totalitarianism, or that it represents the extremes of capitalism. Everybody can choose what they want at any time. These are inconsistent allegations. Either it's imposed by totalitarians or it's radical freedom. Well, I don't know. But the allegations are not always internally consistent, but they do together, taken together, culminate in the conviction that gender is an ideology. Well, what's that? Well, it seems to me that in the allegation, an ideology is understood as a false and dogmatic set of beliefs. Well, I've taught in gender studies for many years, and I understand it as a discipline that is, by definition, interdisciplinary, where scholars from different disciplines come together to think about different methodologies and different paradigms. It's actually defined by a set of problematics or debates, not by statements of doctrine or settled truths. Nobody comes into the gender studies class and is told, you must believe the following things, otherwise you're not going to pass this class. No, that doesn't happen. But there's a fantasy that that's what is happening. In fact, what often happens is that it's a model of open debate. People disagree about everything. Methods, the status of theory, the need for regional ethnographies, the relationship of the academy to social movements. There are, in fact, so many disparate approaches that most courses dedicated to introducing gender studies can hardly manage to include all the points of view that constitute the discipline. I belabor this point only because there are those who would reduce gender to a dangerous ideology and efface the complexity and richness of these frameworks, the many conceptual contributions to thinking about nature, society, power, embodiment, equality. To those who think that gender studies pedagogy is a form of indoctrination, the response should probably be firm. Gender is neither an ideology nor a form of indoctrination. Indeed, the critique of gender within gender studies is quite productive. It's a framework that allows us to ask, among other questions, how is the social world organized? Through what exclusions and with what potentials? The debates on such questions are open-ended. And for those who have learned from the field, that openness is a promising value to be affirmed. For others, social structure should remain unchanging and based on pre-social differences that can be known apart from any interpretive framework or social meanings. I'm pretty sure that Professor Fish over here would agree with me that there's always an interpretive framework, because that's what he taught us. Those who seek to censor books on gender or to close down the teaching of gender studies are often imposing a doctrine on teaching and research, shutting down open debate. Right? We have to read the books and see the films and understand the work in that field and have an informed understanding of it rather than receive a prejudicial understanding of it as a kind of dangerous ideology. No, let's be scholars. Let's read carefully. Let's debate. Let's see what's actually going on. Let's be careful and slow and informed and base our conclusions on evidence. That's what we teach. That's what we do. Okay, so shutting down open debate in public life and open inquiry in the academy does not bode well for democracy. And yet this is what the anti-gender ideology movement calls for. It's a campaign of falsification and censorship that strengthens repressive state powers. The book that I wrote, Who's Afraid of Gender, sought to understand how the intensified opposition to gender fits within the emergence of authoritarian regimes that gain support through the fantasy of restoring patriarchal and heteronormative orders. Okay, so that's a big word, heteronormative, but don't get nervous. It'll become clear in time. The more that gender ideology as a phrase is discussed, as if it describes something real, this fiction becomes part of a shared and emergent cultural understanding, or what some would call a kind of backlash. The complexity of feminism, feminist history, theory, sexuality, and gender studies as fields and their potential to describe and understand human embodiment in its complexity is replaced by a caricature. So who's the social constructionist here? Okay, but that's just one problem. If the only task were to dispel an increasingly prevalent mischaracterization of a field of study, we could simply demonstrate the different approaches to scholarship and teaching and show why, based on the evidence provided, the caricature fails to grasp the field of study, its institutional forms, its effects on social policy and public debate. The caricature of gender ideology is deployed, however, to incite fear, to identify gender as the cause of public anxiety about the future, and to promise a return to a time in which gender binarism and hierarchy could be assumed as unchangeable. By the way, gender does not just characterize identities. It's a framework for understanding a major form of power in society, the way it establishes separate spheres and social inequalities and exclusions. For feminists, gender became an important term in the 1970s through which to describe and criticize social inequalities and the persistence of masculine domination. What does it mean that there is masculine domination in all sorts of cultures? Does it always take the same form? Does it take different forms? How do we understand its apparent generalizability? How do we take account of its specific forms? What generalizations can be said? There's extraordinary anthropological work on that topic. In fact, historians and anthropologists asked about the gendered division of labor. When we talk that way, we're not talking about identities, we're talking about why it is that certain forms of work generally go to men and others generally go to women. There's inquiry into the gendering of the public sphere, and those kinds of inquiries help to formulate and institute public policies that seek to oppose discrimination, to establish equal treatment under the law, to expose and oppose gender-based violence, to delineate specific healthcare needs, and to inquire into the ways society might be transformed to support greater equality. That's a democratic goal. Justice, freedom, those are democratic goals. Gendered frameworks have proven to be productive in ecological politics, migration studies, and anti-violence policies. It's been affirmed as part of the history of freedom and equality, not only demonstrating how and why inequalities or exclusions exist, but contesting discourses and policies that keep a range of people from flourishing. Do we want people to flourish? I think we do. According to the recent executive order delivered by the presidential offices, January 20th, gender is to be removed from all federally funded activity, including healthcare, education, and sports. All of this is done in the name of defending women against gender without realizing that women is itself a gendered category, if not the most important gendered category. what we mean by women changes over time, right? Even in this country alone, in 100 years ago, we could ask, are women fit for certain kinds of work? What is their natural function in society? Can a woman be fulfilled without being a mother? These are open historical questions, and the answers to them change in time. Feminism does not need to be protected against gender. Sex discrimination doesn't need to be protected against gender. It's gender studies that has established the centrality of feminist theory and history of equality in every established and respected research university in the world. Every R1 has gender studies. At issue for the executive order is the question, who counts as a woman? And the problem for those who wish to keep trans women outside the category of women is supposed to be solved by insisting that only the sex assigned at birth is the real one, and that gender is a fiction, or worse, a lie, or a disguise, or a distorted belief system. In other words, original sex assignment is imposed by government as the ultimate and only criterion for deciding who does and does not belong to the category of women or men, and only those two. The fact that the state now defines sex in this way amplifies the power of the state to define and order bodies as if the state were a scientific committee, or that it can make the decision about gender, thus depriving people of that very freedom. The effects of this monopolization of permissible discourse are, I think, quite dangerous, for the state now has the power to deny the very reality of trans lives, to strip trans people of their legal status, their social identity, their access to health care, their rights to participate in sports, and to engage in educational institutions that reflect the history and aspiration of their lives. The anti-gender ideology executive order gave the state the power to strip trans people of their rights and to efface the reality of non-binary and intersexed people. Should people have their identities effaced? Can people flourish in this world when they are told that who they are does not actually exist? I think they cannot flourish. But if we are committed to universality and we want a world in which all of us can flourish, then it seems to me we honor that complexity and we do not try to deny the reality that exists. The state gave itself the power to decide which science should be considered legitimate in deciding sex determination. I've been reading in developmental biology, and I see that there are at least 16 competing paradigms for deciding how sex determination should take place. But our elected officials went for the gamete theory, claiming that there's a larger and smaller gamete at the outset of life, and that this accounts scientifically for the immutable character of binary sex. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way, even scientifically. The term immutable comes, I believe, from Vatican doctrine, although the executive order claims to be based on science, raising the question of whether such a consequential denial of basic rights is motivated by religious fervor or doctrine. Even if we were to take the proposed gamete approach seriously, it seems important to consider that originally all humans come from the larger gamete, which, if we are originalists, or indeed creationists, implies that everyone is originally female. That was, of course, is not the conclusion that the government meant to reach. In general, though, I think if one tries to decide on what basis sex differences should be determined, one has to decide upon a framework and a criteria. All international sports organizations know how difficult this can be given the chromosomal exceptions and the complex distribution of hormones among those assigned male and female at birth, right? So they tried to use chromosomal differences, they tried to use hormonal differences, and they realized that those criteria were unstable. The US government did not consider endocrinology or genetics as a scientific basis for its defense of immutable binary sex. That's interesting. And even the scientific journal Nature tells us why. So which science is being invoked for which purpose? I'm not against science. I actually excelled in biology, and I don't deny the biological reality of bodies, hardly, but I think indeed we have to be careful, again, and ask which framework. There are a series of paradigms in the history of science, as we know, that shift the way in which we think about sex determination in humans and in other species. And it's extremely interesting work, and it is complex, and you need to have some time, some patience, and a capacity to read. Developing literacies in the biological sciences is not so easy for some of us. It is imperative. I'm not against the biological sciences. What I'm against is biological determinism. Okay. What I'm against is biological reductionism. That's not the same as biology. That's both of those, biological determinism and biological reductionism, are social theories that make use of biology to attain certain notions of stability that otherwise would be contradicted by the evidence at hand. Indeed, if we're interested in studying the various frameworks by which sex determination has been accomplished, we would be studying, by the way, gender, because gender is the framework under which we ask questions such as those. In any case, who is to say that the sex assigned at birth is the sex that will come to form one's identity and define one's life? Even the conservative Supreme Court in this country recognized this in Clayton v. Bostock in 2021. It was Gorsuch who actually wrote this opinion. And he made very clear that there's a gap between a sex assignment at birth and a sex that one identifies with in time. And that those who are discriminated against because they are trans are actually being discriminated against on the basis of their perceived sex, which is why trans people should be included and gender nonconforming people should be included as part of the protected class under sex discrimination law. Okay, that's a conservative Supreme Court decision that flies in the face of the executive order. One may well affirm the assignment one is given, right? Assigned female, hey, I love being a woman, I'm gonna be a woman, I'm never gonna change being a woman, this is great for me, this is exactly who I am. That's great, but there is a difference between that assignment and the lived affirmation of that assignment, even among those who are gender conforming. Like, yeah, I was assigned male and I'm a man and that is the way it is and it's the way it should be and I'm really good with that. And don't be taking that away, that's fine. But note, you were assigned something and then you came to affirm it and embodied it in this life. And those are two different things. There are other people who get assigned it and they can't embody it, or it's an existential disaster to even try, right? And there's enormous suffering, and they're not going to be able to flourish if they try to comport with the sex assigned. So if we accept the dual dimension of sex assignment, it's coming from the outside and then being assumed in life, works for some, doesn't work for others. Not sure why we can't live in a world in which we accept that simple fact. Freedom emerges within the constraints in which we live. But determinations, when somebody decides to determine for oneself what is the right sex for that person, they are free to do so. They're also constrained in many ways. And whether one affirms or departs from an original assignment is simply an example of human freedom or agency that is always operating within constraints, including biological ones. But those constraints do not fully govern who we are and what we become. That's what makes us distinctively human. By the way, no one's denying the materiality of the body with such an argument. In fact, the interactive approach to be found in developmental biology assumes that biology and social environment both contribute to sex determination and development. Many feminist biologists work on gender despite the misconception that gender denies biology. What feminism has almost always denied is that biology is destiny. It is not. Nothing in biology alone tells us whether someone will be engaged in reproductive activity, how they will live, or who they will love. The defense of women, as some say, depends fundamentally on that insight formulated by Simone de Beauvoir, the insight that biological determinism is simply mistaken. To repeat, one can be against determinism without being against biology. Indeed, biologists would be the first to affirm that distinction. The fear of gender is only possible, I want to suggest, if gender is made into a terrifying prospect, the name for one's fears and anxieties. But that's not only unreasonable, but ungrounded. The very idea of a gender ideology is a falsehood, and it serves, we might say, an ideology that seeks to amplify state powers and deny both human complexity and human freedoms. The fear of gender, you can be a libertarian and agree with me, right? You don't even have to be like a left-wing academic, woke and all that. You don't have to, I mean, this is fundamental to democratic values. The fear of gender is incited by those who claim that children are at risk of being groomed, indoctrinated, or compelled to become gay, lesbian, or trans. Children should never be indoctrinated, and their rights against sexual coercion should be protected at all costs. But if we look closely at this political discourse, we see that those who attack gender are defending only one doctrine, that which comports with the Vatican's various pronouncements or with nationalist demands to protect the natural, i.e., heteronormative family. That's Viktor Orban's view. Those who defend doctrine over open inquiry are at the forefront of the anti-gender movement. They do not serve children when they deprive them of health care they require. They do not protect children when they ban books that will let them know about the complex family arrangements in this world, the different ways of loving and being. The right to education should be part of any democracy, and no one should be hiding books in the basement that bring an enriched understanding of gender and sexuality into the world. You should be free to study such fields without fear of reprisal. And trans people should be free to live their lives as they are without the fear of violence or pathologization. So let us remember that censorship seeks to shut down both knowledge and imagination, two key values of education. And it does not let children find their own way, emerging into a world that values human curiosity in the principles of open inquiry. Otherwise, ignorance reigns as human freedoms are suppressed and state powers take over the decision of who you can and cannot be. That cannot be the way we organize this world. Thank you.
Is this thing working? Yes. Good. Well, here's what happens now. Oh, someone come and help me.
I think it is. You just have to hold it a little closer.
Hello? Yeah. All right. All right. There must be some unacknowledged phobia of mine that is working. Okay.
I would say that.
I know. I can get away with anything. Now, what's going to happen now is that I'm going to engage Professor Butler in some questions and answers, most of them drawn from the words that you just heard, and also from her recent book. And let me say before I do that, that there has been a long time observation on the part of those critical of Judith Butler that the prose she writes or the words she speaks are undecipherable. Anyone who has been at this occasion knows that that's not true, and that that was a plainly delivered, although complicated, discourse calculated to enlighten an audience willing to listen, which is you. Having said that, let me pass to some questions that I have, which, as I said, are already answered in implication by much of what has been said. There's an old, opposition that has been around forever, or at least as long as we've been engaged as a race in this kind of deliberation, and that is the opposition between nature and culture. And I was going to invite you to speak about that opposition, especially as it relates to the idea of biological essentialism, which is so powerful for many anti-gender polemics. That is, people who say, well, the sexed body is obviously just there. All you have to do is look. It's natural. How do we respond, or how should we respond to that?
Well, let me take a step back. I think there was a time in feminist theory where the claim was made that sex is nature, a natural fact of some kind, and that gender is the social or cultural organization or interpretation of that fact. So something called the sex-gender distinction emerged on the basis of a nature, culture, or nature society distinction. But as I reflect on that, I think it was probably mistaken because, first of all, we're born into the world in a social setting where sex is assigned and where we start to be treated in a certain way. And so society is there at the beginning. We're social creatures. We're social beings. That's one point. But there's a second point, which is that I think, and this is a kind of ecological point, really, that nature is not just a given, and then comes human activity and interpretation and social organization. Bruno Latour has suggested that that idea of nature doesn't understand that there's already an interaction, always, between nature and the human world, and that that the domination of nature has depended, in a way, on all of the activity being human activity, not realizing that nature has its own processes, its own transformations. And we know this, of course, through human aging and through work on epidemiology. We are all the time looking at bodies in relationship to both their biology and their social and cultural formation and interpretation. There's an interaction going on and even a mutual determination that's going on. So whereas my earlier work focused on a kind of performative activity that we make our gender, or we institute it over time, I'm much more interested in an interactive and mutually determining framework now, which would overcome the stark opposition between nature on the one hand and social organization on the other.
I take it that that's what you mean by a phrase in the book, the co-construction
Yes.
of biology and gender. Could
Yes.
you speak about that a bit?
Well, co-constructionism is an approach that one can find in immunology, but also in the history of developmental biology, suggesting that nature has a certain active power that humans in their cultural and social forms also have an active power, that these powers exchange with one another, and that we are a set of exchanges. We are a set of interactions. That's our history. That's our predicament as human creatures. If we think about, even in sports, like what goes into the development of muscle or bone? Well, environment goes into muscle and bone, so does nutrition. Those are environmental factors that become internal parts of the body. Our bones have a social history to them, we might say. And when we look at sports competition and we say, oh, that person was assigned male at birth, they have more musculature. Yes, it may well be because of a hormonal advantage, or maybe that person had access to a private club as a kid, or maybe they were rich enough to have a coach, or, how do we know which of those factors are going into the development of muscle, the development of bone? So I'm suggesting that we need more complex models that show the interaction of these fundamental issues.
Related is a question that, again, touches on something that you said during your presentation, and that is that those, and I'm here paraphrasing passages in your book, those who argue that they must be against gender as they understand it because it does harm are themselves doing a great deal of harm which they either do not acknowledge or could not recognize. Could you just elaborate a bit on the harms done?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that people have to find their way in a highly gendered world, how to relate to masculinity, femininity, norms about that tell us what it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman. We can't prescribe in advance and insist that these meanings are fixed for all time, because history poses new challenges for us. In fact, one reason we're in this dilemma is that there's been an historical shift where many people do question what is meant by gender, or how to understand their own gender, or how to live in a world that's organized by certain gender ideals that don't always comport with one's lived reality. I think that it hurts human flourishing to tell people in advance that they must fit in this category or the other, when their feeling of being alive, of existing, of being an embodied creature depends on changing those categories, or of living to the side of them. And especially young children, those who are bullied for not being properly feminine or not being properly masculine, they are harmed all the time because they're being told there's one right way to be and you have to comport. When actually a world that would allow boys and girls and those who need to live outside those categories or produce their own would be a much more compassionate, accepting world that would allow more people to flourish. So if we're in favor of human flourishing and we accept human complexity, then any effort to impose a set of categories that preempt finding one's way, right, that say you don't get to find your way, you don't get to have a period of imagination or exploration to find your way, to find the place that's right for you. No, you don't get to do that. this is the option, and this is the option, and you belong here and not here. You're dictating in advance, effectively, what a person must become rather than allow them to go through the process of becoming. And every kid needs to have the right to become and to find their own way, not to accept a doctrine, not to be indoctrinated, to find their own way to emerge autonomously in their body and in the social and linguistic world that allows them to live and breathe and be free of violence and free of pathologization.
You say in some of the same passages I was thinking of that one of the harms, perhaps the primary harm at some point, done by anti-gender polemics and programs is to deny the very existence of those they harm. Could you say more about that?
Yes, it's actually what I would call an existential negation, right? The idea that a trans person can no longer call themselves trans or have legal rights to define in that way basically says that the way you have defined yourself is diluted, is wrong, is a figment of your imagination, is the effect of an indoctrination, and that you don't have the capacity to judge for yourself who you need to be or what language you need to have. We, the state, the authorities who deprive you of your right to define yourself, are taking away your freedom and telling you the only possible definition for you, which is a massive imposition on human freedom and human becoming.
Now, related to that, I think, is the issue that you again raise in the book, the people who look at words like construction and performative and equate them with adjectives like fake and unreal. So could you say something about that?
Well, I lost control of performative, I gotta say.
That's
I mean,
all right.
I
lost
even-
control of interpretive communities.
You did. You did. No, I mean, whoa. I mean, people said, now you see performative, it's like fake, theatrical, superficial. Oh my God, how did that happen? You know, what I meant, what I meant by performative, I say for the 17th, the millionth time. Okay. What I meant was to say, you know, we embody social meanings. We are assigned certain kinds of categories. There are expectations. There are other people's desires for us, right? Our parents' desires about who we should be, that we sometimes have to disappoint or contravene. It's not easy. There are social desires to have us conform in certain ways. It sometimes is the case that you're called something, a category is given to you, but you have to figure out how to live that. And you can keep your gender category, right? You're called a girl, you become a woman, then you still have to decide, well, what kind of woman am I going to be? Or what meaning am I going to give to this category? Or I wonder if I could still be a woman and do this and this. Could I have this job? Could I be engaged in this activity? Could I talk that loudly? Could I be that smart and still be inside the category? Or maybe I can help remake the category as I get smarter and stronger and insist on working this way or loving this way, right? So we're constantly renewing those categories. And some of us quite deliberately, like, okay, I've been named a woman and there was an expectation that as a woman I would do this, but I am revising what it means to be a woman, right? And I remember, you know, when Gloria Steinem turned 60, I think it was, And somebody said, "Oh my God, I can't believe you're 60." And she said, "This is what 60 looks like." And what was she doing? She was saying, "Yeah, this is 60." I mean, 60 is now past for me, but still, she was saying, "This is what it looks like." It's like, "Oh, you don't look 60. No, this is what 60 looks like, right? You don't look old. No, this is what old looks like, you know." So, what are we doing at those? Those are performative moments where the action, the embodiment of the category changes the meaning of the category. And we do that. It's an embodied, real transformation of social discourse to make it mean something new, to allow it to include more people, to allow it to change meanings in the service of greater complexity, greater freedom, greater equality. I don't know. I'm still not destroying civilization as we know it.
No, well, not yet. In fact, in one passage in your book, and I'm quoting directly, no one has said that sex is not real. That is, to say that sex or gender are performative is not to say they're not real, and then you go on. But many of us have asked what its reality consists of. And I guess that's what you would think is the content of gender studies.
Well, it's one question that emerges in gender studies, especially as we look cross-culturally at the different ways that sex is assigned, at the different ways in which kinship figures in sex assignment, in the criterion that's used. You know, the term gender was coined by John Money, the sexologist, no feminist, right? No hero of mine. But when he coined gender in this way, he realized that he was dealing with what he called hermaphroditic infants who were intersexed, and he had no idea how best to assign sex when somebody has mixed sexual characteristics or when it's chromosomally unclear. Like, how do we go about assigning sex in such matters? So gender was for him a problem. It was like, oh, we have an inquiry here. What is the best way to go about assigning sex? How do we determine it? And so he acknowledged that sex determination could be a problem and that there had to be criteria invoked in sex determination. And he tried to do that, and he also engaged in all kinds of surgeries to conform, to try to get infants to conform with his idea of gender. But for him, sex alone was not enough to decide gender because sex could be complicated and because there's always a framework within which that assignment takes place. Now, you might think, oh, I'm just using a small community or an exception to the rule, but he allowed us to think about a question that all international sports organizations are thinking about, like, oh my God, which criterion do we use? Is it chromosomes? Is it endocrinology? Is it what, nobody is looking at the gamete issue. So, the executive order is not going to help us with that. But it's been very vexed. And it turns out that a lot of very capable men in sports, assigned male at birth, have less testosterone than some women assigned female at birth. It's like, oh my God. So there's a continuum, and even neurologically, there's some wonderful work done to show the mosaic of brain differences between male and female, as it were. So, what do we do? Are we interested in science or not? It seems to me that when people say this is a biological fact, they're telling me they're not actually interested in science.
One last question of mine before we invite the audience to ask questions, and this may not be one you want to take up. It goes more to my interest, perhaps.
That's fine.
Than yours. But there are times in the book where you speak about the invocation and insistence on and even a triumphant flourishing of something called plain language. Plain language. And I wondered if you've thought of any relationship between the veneration on the part of some of plain language and biological essentialism.
Well, plain language is interesting because President Trump, in his former term, had his health department try to come up with a formulation that would link gender to sex, and he wanted to insist as well that we use plain language to refer to sex. So there's obviously something called non-plain language, or I'm not sure, maybe obscure language, or language that's not part of ordinary discourse. But the problem is that ordinary discourses are actually quite numerous. And a person can, and I certainly have experienced this myself, move from one cultural situation to another and be identified through plain language in ways that are in contradiction to the next way one is identified in plain language. Right. So people imagine that their perception is transparent, that they know the truth of what somebody's sex is, but they're always, in fact, mistaking it or apologizing. Oh, I'm so sorry, I said he, or...
It's the same thing as thinking they know the truth of what someone said.
Yes, also. But I think when we insist on plain language, and look, I'm all in favor of communicating in a clear way, and if I haven't done that today, then I apologize, because I do want to reach you and I do want to hear you. And I believe in dialogue. I even think Socrates was a pretty great guy. A little rough with his interlocutors sometimes. But they shouldn't have put him to death for engaging in open inquiry, right? Open inquiry. They put him to death for asking too many questions. We're not going to do that, right? But look, when somebody decides what plain language is and they circumscribe it, it's like, what are they trying to get rid of? You know, like, what are they saying? And it's plain for whom? And
right.
In what language? Is it English? You know, is it like, what about the problem of translation or multilingual communities where there are very different ways of referring to masculine and feminine? And I was in Japan, it became clear that masculine and feminine couldn't be who you are. It actually was simply an inflection of the verb of whatever you're doing. And I thought, well, that's another theory of gender.
All right. So the title of the book is Who's Afraid of Gender?
Yeah.
Is the answer almost everyone in a certain defensive mode?
I think that gender raises questions for all of us, fundamental questions about sexuality, identity, appearance, comportment, what's expected of us in the world, questions of power, equality. You know, they impinge upon us from different domains. So, you know, gender, you have to find your way with gender. And I don't think there's a pre-given script. Or there shouldn't be, and that means we're all going to have some anxiety about it. But when someone says, like Giorgia Meloni, oh, the gender ideologists, if they win, you won't be able to say mother and father anymore. You won't be able to say I'm a mother or I'm a father. It's like, who's ever said that? I've been reading in this field for 40 years. I have never seen anything like that. There's no such person who's saying you can't say you're a mother or a father. Goodness gracious. I mean, it's a hallucination.
Let me shamelessly rehearse an anecdote from my own academic experience. When I was at Duke, I was a member, the president of Duke established a committee to study the status of women in the university. This would have been in the middle 80s. And so as a committee, we went around talking to the different departments and schools. And we got to the medical school. And I think this was the Department of Pediatrics, actually. And I was saying, as a matter of introduction, that we were here to try to examine their protocols, their their procedures, and the way in which they organize their practice, to see if any of them might be gender specific in ways they didn't recognize. And someone raised, I think, his hand, I'm sure it was his hand, and said, gender specific. I never heard that term. What could it possibly mean? Well, perhaps by virtue of the work that you and others have done, even that person now knows. Thank you very much, Professor Butler. And now, for questions from the audience, this gentleman has been raising his hand.
I agree with most of what you say. In most modern societies, not just our country, there's a presumption of protection of youth. And the protection of youth goes to certain ages, whether it's 14 in some societies, 18 or in other societies. At what point does youth themselves, a child, should they be given the choice of, well, I'm a boy and not a girl and I want to be treated that way? At what point should medical society be given the choice of a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old that they presume might be a girl instead of a boy, or a boy instead of a girl, so they start to treat them in a way that could end up surgically destroying or making them closer to what they are, until probably they are at some age to really make that decision, say 16, 18, whatever you want to choose. So when should the society allow?
Has been asked.
Okay,
Now we get the answer.
is there a
No.
Sorry, I don't agree with you, but that's fine.
I think my concern is that when a young person of any age comes forward and says, you know what, I understand myself to be of this gender, which is not the sex assigned to me, that young person be given a supportive environment to find their way, not to be pathologized, not to be denied care, but to be given space and time and an environment to explore. Because it's true, we don't always know ourselves right away, certainly. We've all gone through changes where we realize something much later than we thought we probably should. So I don't have an opinion on this topic. People do ask me, they want me to say at this age, at this age. What I think my job is, as a scholar, but also as somebody who is committed to not doing harm to children, is to allow for care and support for a child to find their way. And I don't think we rush, and I don't think we block. And I think rushing could be a problem, and I think refusing to accept it is a terrible problem.
How about a student question?
Okay.
Yes. Do you have a microphone? Wait a minute.
I graduated from New College, and I last saw you at your Verso book signing where you declared your new gender identity. And now I'm a student continuing in religion, gender, and culture, no longer with Amy, but I have a question about the future of gender studies. I graduate maybe next year and I'll be going on the job market. Religion and gender studies, whatever it matters, these departments are getting eliminated. The job numbers are very low, if not, negative. So what do you see as a way to fight this type of precarity or deal with it, to keep moving forward, to keep reading the books?
Yes. Yes. Well, first of all, in writing this book, Who's Afraid of Gender, I did a fair amount of reading in the gender and religion journals, and it's an incredible field of study. It's absolutely interesting, and but look, there's a broader question here. How are we going to defend the humanities? How are we going to defend the interpretive social sciences? How are we going to defend interdisciplinary work on the environment, or interdisciplinary work on gender or on migration? We actually are facing a larger problem, which is that universities and colleges are more and more looking to the STEM fields and for fields that immediately translate into profitable outcomes for themselves or for their students. And we need to make a stronger public case for the humanities and for that kind of work, the work you're doing, which is in such an important field. We need to be committed to values, for instance. We need to be committed to thinking about how the world is organized and how it should be organized. We can't just rely on technologies to answer that question, or even instrumental or utilitarian calculations. We actually need to think radically about the values we want to live by and how we want our world to be organized. I think this is a much bigger question, and it has to do with the neoliberal university, it has to do with privatization, it has to do with the STEM fields and the future of the humanities. And Stanley probably has more to say on that than I do.
Not here.
Not here.
Okay, in the back? Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry, yes.
Hi.
No,
Microphone.
no. Was the young lady, yeah. I think. Maybe not. I don't know, no.
Is gender entirely coercive? And if it is it possible at all for humanity, human people, human individuals to flourish within that coercive framework?
Within the what?
Which is the coercive framework?
Is gender entirely coercive?
Oh no,
And
a lot of people love their
That's
gender.
true.
Are you kidding? I mean, some people really love the gender that they're like doing it, they're loving it, they want it, they don't want anybody taking it away, and I think that's fine. I think that's great, but given that some people love being the gender they are, imagine what it's like not to love it, or not to be able to embody it, right? I think we have to realize there is that spectrum where sometimes gender norms are really coercive, and other times it's like, oh, this is fun, or this is great, or yes, this is me, or there's maybe some ambivalence or disidentification, but you make your way through. I don't think it's just coercive. No, I wouldn't say that.
I'll get the microphone.
As a piggyback on the question of coerciveness, is there a relationship between our current society's gender expectations, which we understand can look a lot of ways, but, painting in broad strokes, and the expectation of productivity, money-making, efficiency, etc.?
I think that's a great question. I'm not sure I have an immediate answer to it, except that it affects it affects women and men very differently because it also connects with family, presupposes that somebody's doing the reproductive labor of family. And who's doing that? And how does that get worked out? But I think hyperproductivity, acting as an investor or acting as a profit-seeking person involves a evaluation of activity and of amassing wealth, or as engaging in certain kinds of risk-taking, and that can become very masculinized. It can become a kind of, like Milei in Argentina has, some people have said he has masculinized financial risk. Like it's the masculine thing to do, to take a big risk with your money, and not to worry so much about being a provider anymore. So he's taken the ideal of masculinity away from being a father who's responsible for a family into the market where risk and gambling is the new man. So there are complex ways of understanding this, and I don't have time to do your good question justice. Yeah, right here.
So you've been hinting and talking on how gender is such a societal construct, of which we have the signs of where the men go, women go. We have the spaces. So when we're looking at societal and rights, how do you balance a trans person saying they have the right to use whichever bathroom they want to use, what they align with, and the dad with 2 young daughters says he has the right to know who's in the bathroom with his daughters? So how do you balance 2 seemingly controversial, conflicting rights when in a societal space?
I have 2 things to say. One, if there are stalls, I don't really think we have a problem. 2, I think that those who have fear about the bathroom are imagining that a trans woman is actually a man, and if that person is actually a man, then they have the most nefarious possible desires that any man has ever had, right? Like worse than the men we know in life. Like certainly not my son, certainly not my brother, right? Just, a kind of attribution is made. And it happens, I think, in the prison example as well. The fear that a trans woman in a woman's prison will do harm to other women. Well, what are the statistics on that? I know of 3 examples. But if we ask who is harming women in prison, it turns out it's guards, right? And they're cis, and they're, overwhelming abuse of women by guards. But why aren't we focusing on that? Why do we take the exceptional moment and say, oh, this is what trans women really do? They attack young girls in bathrooms, and they attack women in women's prisons. It's like if you were to take a couple of examples and of what it means to be, say, of a Jewish person who has engaged in a corrupt financial activity, and then you said on the basis of those 2 or 3 examples, I'm going to say that all Jews are that way, we would say you can't say that, right? We would say that's anti-Semitic. And if you did the same thing with a black person who committed, all black people. No, we stop people. We say that's a false generalization. What are you doing using that example as the paradigm, as a model for understanding? That is not the way it goes. Plus, it doesn't understand the the destruction of masculinity that that a trans woman actually lives. So nobody has bothered to actually think about what the trans woman's relationship to masculinity is, even to masculine privilege. So yeah, I have obviously a lot to say about that.
Just wanted to ask you that what's the percentage of trans people today versus in the 1960s, and why?
It's such a good question. I don't have that answer. And I'm not sure who would be collecting that data. I mean, I will say that obviously the issue of trans has become a huge public issue so that people are talking about it more, and we do see more and more people coming out, but I don't have that data. I don't even know how I would get it.
Also, wouldn't it be the case, Judith, that something now has become visible in a way that it probably wasn't before? You and I both remember when Christine Jorgensen suddenly emerged in the world, and the assumption was that she was the only person who had ever undergone any such transformation. Although now we know how many people, let's say in the American 19th century, were living lives that were not the lives assigned to them by midwives at birth, and we only know either by memoir or by later revelation.
Yeah.
So it might be a case of now that everything is more open and public, that the numbers seem larger.
Yeah, that may be true.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I was going to give the mic to the, yeah. Raise your hand. No, not you.
Not you. He's not calling on you. I don't know why he's not calling on you.
All right. That's right. Yeah, stand up.
Thank you, Dr. Butler, for coming.
No.
I'm sorry. Here you go.
I'll take the thank you.
Thank you. As you may know, in the past 2 years, you are today speaking at an institution that has no longer a gender studies program and has stripped its Gender and Diversity Center of its library and its resources. And I wanted to ask you what it means to be speaking today, and what inspired you to speak today, and what do you have to say to the trans and queer community here still at New College?
Yeah. Well, obviously, one of the main reasons I'm here is to try to make the case that gender studies should be reinstated. But also, if anyone's interested, I can actually show you why the major research institutions in this world all have lively gender studies programs, and I can show you how they're organized and why it works and how many people benefit from it and why it's not a indoctrination or an ideology, why it's actually a field of study that produces an array of opinions and theories and paradigms and forms of knowledge, not all of which agree with me, by the way. I'm also highly criticized in most gender studies classes. So, you know, I'm but one perspective, and there are people who definitely take different ones from me, and that's extremely important. We haven't even talked about anti-colonial or decolonial feminism. We haven't talked about black feminism. We haven't talked about ecofeminism and the relationship of that to queer theoretical paradigms, which are now very much in tension with trans paradigm. You know, we could go on for some time thinking about gender in law, gender in medicine, gender in history. But these are lively, important debates, and debate is at the center of these forms of knowledge. We all become smarter through engaging in disagreement, by holding each other to different kinds of standards, by asking each other to back up what we're saying. I've become a better thinker over time because of my critics, and I'm happy about that. We don't all sing in unison, that's for sure. So yes, I'm here especially because you did undergo the closing of those programs in 2023, and I followed that. And I would like to suggest that there are ways to reconsider that decision to make this place equal to the best research institutions of the world.
Well, that answer just about coincides with the time that we have, and it allows me to thank Professor Butler for an engaging clarity and a willingness to answer all questions in even and considered tones, and therefore provide for us a model of what she is recommending. Thank you.